Good evening, everyone. Let me start by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and we pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome to tonight's online seminar, which will be delivered by Professor Tom Papademetriou on the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople and the Ottomans. Allow me to go through some housekeeping items before we venture into tonight's seminar. We would like to thank the sponsor of tonight's seminar, Peter Batisteos, on behalf of HEPA. I invite you all to become sponsors of a seminar of your choice. It's only a tax-deductible $100 donation. Furthermore, let me remind you that during the month of May, there will be two seminars held at the mezzanine level of the Greek Center on the dates of the 6th of May, which is next Thursday, and also the 19th of May. These will be hybrid events and simultaneously broadcast, and it'd be good to see as many of you as possible at the Greek Center in order to reactivate that social connection that this seminar series has brought to us in the past. The other seminars in May will be online due to interstate or international speakers. Next Thursday's seminar at the Greek Center is by locally based Jeffrey Conahan. It's entitled Entwined, Trade, Politics, and Geography, the Textiles of Castellodes's Unique Women's Costume. And just a reminder for those that will have any questions during our Q&A interval, simply submit them through the chat or comments section on Facebook or YouTube, and we will pick them up. Let's move to the topic of tonight's presentation, which is on the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, an institution founded during the late Roman, early Byzantine period, but so far with a staying power of more than 1,500 years. During this time, it has withstood the vicissitudes of history, it has endured decline, collapse, shock, recovery, rebuilding, redentism, consolidation of power, and the challenge of reform and nationalism. The focus of tonight's seminar will be on the Patriarchate's Ottoman legacy. It managed to survive intact despite the numerous social, religious, financial, and political constraints during this period by the Ottoman authorities. It managed to adeptly negotiate the complexities and idiosyncrasies of Ottoman cultural, political, and its social landscape, while at the same time serving the needs of the faithful. With us today to shed light on his stories, Professor Tom Papademetriou, who's kind enough to share his time with our Melbourne audience here. I believe it's around 5 a.m. in New Jersey on the US's East Coast. So thank you for making the time. Professor Papademetriou received his PhD from Princeton University's Department of Near Eastern Studies in Ottoman history, where he conducted research in the Ottoman archives, the archives of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Istanbul, and at the Center for Asian Minor Studies in Athens. His research focused on the history of non-Muslims under Ottoman rule, especially the relations of the Greek Orthodox Church and the state in the early Ottoman centuries, which is the subject of his book, Render Unto the Sultan, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. The book also examines internal Greek Orthodox communal concerns within a larger Ottoman social and economic context, while at the same time it challenges the standardist understanding of Muslim-Christian relations. Presently, he is the Constantine and Georgian Georgiou Endowed Professor of Greek History and a Director of the Dean C. and Zoe S. Pappas Interdisciplinary Center for Hellenic Studies of Stockton University. Good morning, Professor Demetriou. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nick, and Kalispera σας, Christos Anesi. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to talk about a topic that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and so allow me to begin. As we think about the Ecumenical Patriarchate, our first As we think about the Ecumenical Patriarchate, we ought to think first of the institution that exists today. And certainly we have the Patriarch of Constantinople Patriarch Bartholomew, who is this 270th bishop, and according to tradition, of the throne of St. Andrew. And certainly he has the title of Archbishop of Constantinople, New Rome, and Ecumenical Patriarchate. And the title, of course, was established in the 6th century of ecumenical, and it remains today within the tradition of the Greek Orthodox Church. To give us a sense of the number of patriarchs that existed, there are between, let's say, the founding and the accounting of the early Christian era up to about 1450, we actually have 159 patriarchs. From 1453 to 1923, there are about 101 patriarchs. And then in the last century, there are 9 patriarchs from 1924 to 2022. The thing, though, is that these numbers count individual patriarchs, but the number of actual times that they serve on the throne, some serve 3 and even 4 times, the numbers increase when we talk about the number actual of changes of the Patriarchate. So I've been thinking about the topic for some time, and one of the things that I focused on the period up until about 1600, and since I finished my book, I've been pushing and thinking about how to think about the periods afterwards, all the way to the 20th century, to encompass the entire Ottoman period. And so I've put together a breakdown, a chronological breakdown that I'm still working with, and I'm trying to think about how to best describe each period and think about what are some of the important dynamics taking place, both in terms of the internal administration of the Patriarchate and the way in which it functions, but also the experience, the external context. And so that's always one of the things that I try to do, is to examine the context and thinking about the social changes that are taking place in society, and understanding that they actually impact the way in which the church functions. The church is an example of culture created by people, and therefore, the external social aspects certainly impact that. I also, acknowledge, of course, for communicants and people of faith, that this is a timeless institution, because there are certain theological and even doctrinal things that have the timeless aspect. But as a human experience, the church militant, as it's called, it does reflect the social aspects of society. So thinking about the earliest decline and collapse up until 1453. 1453, of course, brings the conquest of Constantinople, which is shock and recovery. There's a period of rebuilding of the great Church of Christ up until about 1600. And then there's this era that I begin to think about as the consolidation of authority and consolidation of the church itself in the 17th century. Traditional view of the patriarch as ethnarch we begin to see taking place in the 18th century. And then, of course, the 19th century is this kind of crazy long century, as we think about it, that has so many major aspects, including the Reform era, as well as the growth of nationalism, and even the breakdown of actual jurisdictional locations. So I'm going to kind of try to do a quick survey of this. So this is a whirlwind of going through a long period of time. But among the first questions I like to ask is what was the organization of the Patriarchate at the end of the Byzantine Empire? How did it deal with its contraction and the Turkish conquest of Asia Minor? And so just as a quick reminder, when we think about Byzantium, this is kind of the largest extent, covering the areas of Asia Minor, the Balkans, Middle East, and North Africa having Byzantine political control. And of course, at the heart of Constantinople, the Hagia Sophia, this imperial capital, which is kind of a splendid example of just imperial strength. Now, what happens when that strength encounters the Turk? Of course, we think about the rise of the Turkmen tribes, the Seljuks in particular, that in 1071 defeat the Byzantines during the Battle of Manzikert, and then, of course, a contraction taking place, further impacted by the Crusade, the Fourth Crusade in particular, that in a sense destroys the power and control of the imperial center, and dispersing people to the Asia Minor countryside in the Balkans and Trebizond for successors, kingdoms in exile. And then, of course, by the time we get to the Ottomans, we have a very contracted geography of the Byzantine Empire. So, of course, this impacts the church. When we talk about the power of the church, there is, when we see a map like this of the Asia Minor countryside, which indicate small Turkmen tribes, the Emirates, we see the inability of the state to govern and also, or to rule over the provinces. And in the wake of the state declining, the bishops do step forward. And so we begin to see the bishops taking on roles of leadership in Asia Minor. And so among the goals of the Patriarchate, of course, was to maintain cohesion and unity of the church amidst a collapsed state. It's this major contraction between the 11th and the 15th century. We see the sees of the hierarchy, the actual listings that take place, the listing that are recorded in a compendium called the Notitiae Episcopatum, a list of hierarchical sees. We actually see a decline in numbers, and we a number of examples in the patriarchal acta of bishops being either expelled or assigned to other sees on account of they're not able to sustain themselves, or they decide to accept direct rule of a Turkish emir, and they negotiate in order to remain in their location. So with that, we have a series of sources that describe the patriarchal acts. And so among them, we have 26 acta that deal with and mention the Turks. And they reveal discord, oppressive violence. They talk about bishops, and the acta are the documents from the center, from Constantinople at the synod, and they are responding to what's going on among local bishops. And they reveal that certain local bishops are willing to accept the political will of a local Turkish emir, and that they remain in their see, in their position, by giving cash gifts to the emir, and this later becomes institutionalized in the Ottoman period. So this ability to remain in place is predicated on the fact that they are actually giving the emir a cash donation, or it's not a donation, a cash gift. And so from that, we begin to see an idea emerge for the Ottomans of understanding the patriarch as being someone who can provide a monetary sum in order to receive their throne. And this is part of Ottoman tradition as well, becomes institutionalized even for Ottoman positions. The idea of a pishkesh, meaning a gift, in order to be installed into a position. But there's also the added aspect of the church is responsible for geography and territory, as well as it's a jurisdiction over resources. And so money coming into the church for a panegyri, or for baptisms and weddings or funerals, the owning of orchards, the owning of buildings that receive rent and things like that, are all in a sense calculated. And the bishop then becomes, let's say, the representative controlling all of those aspects, and as a result has to give a certain sum of money in order to receive the see, in order to receive that position, and therefore they are able to take their place. Now, we're still talking, when the Ottomans are under rule, we're talking about their controlling territories also in the Balkans as well. From the early 1380s, they are basically completely in control of what is Greece. And so there are figures that we have. There are examples of certain issues, theological issues, that are being that the church is enduring in this late period. There's some what's called a controversy of the Hesychast tradition, and we have an interesting example of Saint Gregory Palamas, who was Archbishop of Thessaloniki and was a champion of the Hesychasm. He actually had been captured by the Ottomans and has a very detailed account of his experience having an interaction with them. He was a respected prisoner, which meant that he was not in shackles or in chains, but he was allowed to walk among, let's say, the Greek Orthodox community, that the Rum community that's near Bursa, that's near Nicaea, and in the region of northwest Anatolia. And so we actually have an encounter, one of the first encounters of the grandson, the Emir Orhan, and who's still understood as an emir at this time, not quite yet a sultan. But in terms of the Emir Orhan wants Gregory to have a dialogue with his own theologians, and it's a very fascinating story. So you should anybody can look this up. I do detail it in my own book as well. With that said, we also have the experience of the Patriarchate is responding again in the synodal acta to a number of issues. They see the Turks coming as a depredation on their Christian community, and so when they see this, they actually they respond. And so I just wanted to share a couple examples. One is from 1387. The Holy Synod of the Patriarchate reacts to a direct collaboration between the Metropolitan of Mida, named Matthew, and an emir from the Hamid Emirate, kind of on the southern Mediterranean coast. And the acta claims that the Metropolitan and the emir were enjoying the spoliation of a metropolitan see belonging to another, namely the see of Theophilos, the Metropolitan of Atalia Pyrgi. The emir, by his own authority, granted ecclesiastical properties that were within his own territory to the Metropolitan of Mida. And the Patriarchal Synod concluded that Metropolitan Matthew of Mida had no right to take over the rightful prerogatives of Theophilos, and reasoning that it was unacceptable to receive properties from the lay people, first of all, or any lay authority. So that's one, but especially because he's a Turkish emir, and the Turkish emir made the decision. So that's one example where the Synod of Constantinople is seeing this contraction, and this is a local arrangement by a metropolitan in the southern part of Asia Minor, making a deal with the emir trying to stay in place. And so you can begin to suspect that maybe he is trying to overstep and he's using the local authority. And so the Patriarchate Synod is responding. We have another example in 1394, the Metropolitan of Chalcedon, with today Kadikoy. the Ottomans had taken over an independent monastery of Akapnios and given it to this metropolitan of Chalcedon. And the synod condemned this transfer. They condemned the metropolitan of Chalcedon for acting, quote, acting like the Ottomans, unquote. The Ottoman intervention irritated the Patriarchal Synod because it was not only a lay authority, but an enemy regime intervening in ecclesiastical administration. And the Synod charged that the Metropolitan had violated the holy canons, his sin was characterized as greed, and he was admonished to read from the work of a 3rd century writer from the Pontus, St. Gregory the Wonder Worker, on the subject of greediness. They admonished him, who out of greed stole his colleagues' properties and had what we would call a collaborationist relationship. The synod then closed its remarks by warning the metropolitan against being considered a publican and a foreigner, which in their estimation were terrible characterizations. And so we have to think about why would these bishops kind of do this, but also the perspective of the center of the Constantinople synod and their approach to the world. And of course, one of their concerns, of course, is to stay within, and protect local Christian tradition, perhaps to minister and to protect them. But there's also an aspect, of course, the financial aspect and jurisdictional aspects. The Synod of Constantinople, of course, was preoccupied with theological issue of the Hesychast tradition, and then also the discussion, this kind of impending doom that the Turks are breathing down their neck, and the idea that they need to turn to the West. And we have example of these the Council of Florence Ferrara, which was in a sense a reunion council, not accepted by the people or the Church of Constantinople necessarily, but the hierarchy and the emperor of the time signed at least a union. So this is going on at the highest levels in a sense. But what's going on in the countryside, there's a bit of detachment between those things. Now, there's a unionist patriarch, Gregory Mamas. He's elected in 1443. And he's forced to abdicate in 1451 by a group of anti-unionists. And so he ends up leaving Constantinople. He ends up going to Rome and living until about 1459. So we find that before the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the see is vacant. So there's no sitting patriarch when Constantinople is conquered. So it's vacant between 1451 and 1454. So that brings us to the period of shock and recovery. So how does the conquest of Constantinople affect the Patriarchate, and how does it survive in order and recover from the conquest? And so, of course, we have the traditional the story of a contraction. This is basically an Ottoman map. It shows the Ottoman Empire between 1413 and 1451, right on the eve of the conquest. And of course, in the area of Constantinople, it still remains Byzantine. And of course, this is just a matter of time. And so the siege, we know, of course, the walls do their job, but of course, the canon of Urban, the canon maker, is tremendous, and the intention of Mehmet II, Fatih Mehmet II, is too much and overwhelms the Byzantine forces. And of course, one of the first things that Mehmet, when he does conquer the city, he goes to the Hagia Sophia and claims it to make it into his mosque. And so as he's in awe of the building itself, when there's accounts of him walking actually on the dome and overseeing the entire city, but also just seeing this as the fulfillment of one of the sayings of the prophet that says, "Verily, the one who conquers Constantinian is blessed." And so he has this this notion that this is fulfillment of an Islamic idea, but perhaps even more important is the idea, and we see kind of, here's a brief map of the city. We see that he actually has a imperial aspiration, that he believes himself as a continuator of the Caesars themselves. And so part of his goal then, when he takes Constantinople, is to recreate an imperial capital city. And he has just depopulated the city through this conquest, and therefore needs to put people back in. And he refuses to put his own troops. He doesn't want soldiers. He doesn't want shepherds. He doesn't want, in a sense, simply Turkish migrants. And so he realizes, in order to rebuild the city, he must include the former residents, Greeks, Armenians, and even Jews, to occupy the city. And he tries very hard to actually, there's a process called Surgun, which is a forced population movement. He tries to bring people, and people kind of fade away. They don't trust him. They don't trust the city, the Christians, and therefore, how is he able to convince them that, in fact, he wants to recreate an imperial city? As a result of that, he calls on the figure of Gennadios, who is an anti-unionist monk. George Scolarios later becomes Gennadios Scolarios. And the account by Kritovolos, a court historian writing in Greek, he says, in the end, he made the patriarch and high priest, and gave him, among many other rights and privileges, the rule of the church, all its power and authority, no less than that enjoyed previously under the emperors. And he granted him the privilege of delivering before him fearlessly and freely many good disquisitions concerning the Christian faith and doctrine. He himself went to his residence, taking with him the dignitaries and wise men of his court, and thus paid him great honor. So this is, of course, the experience of that we understand that the Fatih Mehmet grants to the patriarch or calls him to become the patriarch. And this happens in January of 1454. And so this story ends up being told again. This is a contemporary and told in the late 1450s and 1460. But then 100 years later, we actually have in the Patriarchal Chronicles, which are a series of things that are produced in the 1600s, again, another description. The Sultan greatly loved the patriarch, going to learn that he was a most wise, most and worthy of reverence. And he gave to him the Church of the Holy Apostles, and he, Gennadios, made it a patriarchate. Then the Sultan went in person to the patriarchate, to the church of Pamakarios, went to the chapel, and he spoke and discussed with him the patriarch Lord Gennadios. And the patriarch demonstrated to him the entire truth of our faith without a single fear, wrote down for him, according to his questions, 20 chapters, which appear below one at a time, which it says gave these to the same Sultan. So in fact, Mehmet was intent on learning something. He asked, they had these conversations, and in fact, we have a record of both in Greek and in Ottoman Turkish of a belief, what the Christians believe, that Gennadios wrote for the Sultan himself, who wanted to learn what the Christian faith really meant. And so it's an interesting example. And the fact that Fatih Sultan Mehmet did not want to go into the church itself, because he realized that if he goes in, it would immediately be turned into a mosque. So these are interesting examples. And then, of course, there's kind of other interesting stories related. This brings up the idea of this notion. Many people use this to describe the establishment of a millet system. And the millet system is really an idea that understands the patriarch as the de facto ruler of the Greek Orthodox community. Now, this is the received wisdom, but we don't have evidence that this is actually the case. We have other dynamics going on. We understand that Gennadios is kind of raised and elevated by the Sultan, which it begins the tradition of sultans being responsible for the appointment of a patriarch. And so he tells subsequently, when either he appoints somebody or the community wants to appoint someone as a replacement, the Sultan has to give the okay. The okay, though, is very specific. It details certain responsibilities. So just to kind of reiterate, there's the traditional view that this is the beginning of what is known as the millet system, which is the Greek Orthodox community is a state within a state, and that the bishop has control over all the people. This is not a correct view. What we find instead is that the patriarch continues the tradition of being responsible for the financial resources to give to the state. In a sense, it's due from the financial resources of the church. And so we find the development of a millet taking place at a much later period where he does have much more power and control. But at this point, the Patriarchate is at its weakest. And so this comes from a manuscript of the Maskinos, the Studate, which is one of the early patriarchal chronicles, talking about the various kind of patriarchs in order. And so Patriarch Gennadios served as patriarch for 3 terms, ultimately retiring to the monastery of St. John of Serres because he was tired, as the chronicles say, of the great scandals. And so you have to ask, what are these scandals? And so in 1464 and 1466, there's one of the patriarchs, Patriarch Yoasaph, jumps into a well to kill himself. He was kind of overwhelmed by the great pressure. He was a peaceful man. And of course, we learned from the chronicles that, in fact, Patriarch Yoasaph, he was trying to hold the line on marriage of a noted figure named George Amidoutsis of Trebizond. Amidoutsis wanted to get married for, I think, illegally, to kind of leave his wife and take someone else's wife. And so the patriarch says no. And George of Trebizond reaches out to Mahmud Pasha, one of the viziers, and on Amidoutsis' bidding, Mahmud Pasha, the chronicle says, acted like the Sultan, cut the patriarch's beard, and sliced the great ecclesiastic's nose on both sides. And so we have kind of the intervention and the being very involved in the patriarchal dealings. This is kind of bringing them into the institution itself. So they're very active, and they're, when called upon by various factions, they're brought into the conflicts that are taking place within there. And then, of course, at a later period, these Trebizond, Trapezunda, this community becomes very powerful, and there is another conflict that takes place, and this actually is between a patriarch, Marcos Xylokaravis, and Simeon of Trebizond, who had the support of people like George Amidoutsis, and even of people who entered the Sultan's service as devshirme, they're called, or that we identified janissary are some, but they're chief ministers that are the sons of Trebizond families. And so we begin to see charges of simony. They're now paying for their offices. This traditional fee that I talked about much earlier is kind of is still in place, but now the Ottomans see it as standard, but because they're critiquing their fellow hierarchs, they're calling it simony and corruption. So they begin to talk about corruption, simony, and the chronicles begin to speak fully about these things. There's one figure, interesting, Patriarch Raphael. He's Serbian. He serves from 1475 to 1476. He's not liked at all by any of his the Constantinopolitan Greeks, and he pays 500 florins, 500 gold pieces, and he promises 200 florins yearly. But because he did not have support from the community, he could not gather those funds, and as a result, he lands in a debtor's prison, and he has this kind of terrible end, being kind of destitute and isolated from prison, and then kind of in the community. So, thinking about what these scandals are about, this is kind of a description from a primary source. This is a barat of appointment for Simeon, and it's from I believe it's 1483, and so this describes here multezim, right? This idea, this individual would become a multezim, who would be responsible for all of these locations, and you can kind of see some of the places: Varna, Philippe, right? Philippopoli, Drama, Saloniki, Poros, Athena, Corinthos, Paleopatra, and all these kind of locations. So they're identifying the regions that the patriarch's in charge of, but they use this term multezim. And so just to speak briefly on that, multezim literally means tax farmer. It is granting the right to the patriarch to be responsible to collect the taxes for the church, like all of these kind of church oriented, not for all of Christians, not the non-Muslim head tax, not what we call the jizya. It doesn't include that. The jizya is collected by the state. This is a tax it's a protection tax. It's actually a non-Muslim tax in order to just exist, in a sense. But from that standpoint, the multezim collects all of the taxes related to the church. And so as a result, they go from bishop to bishop, and each bishop is supposed to collect from their local communities all the different fees and give a portion of what they've collected to the patriarch. And the patriarch then is supposed to give a portion to the sultan. And sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes the patriarch is not able to do it. And I'll give some examples in a couple of minutes on that. So with that said, the patriarch, just in summary, he's required to submit the tax to the imperial treasury on behalf of the entire church. So this is kind of a more extended description, and there's some other things about how the patriarch has rights to appoint, and that what happens on their death, if their bishops or metropolitans die, if the amount is over 5,000 florins, then the patriarch receives. So it's a very financial oriented. There are a few items though, and you can see down towards the bottom. If a woman flees her husband, or if an unbeliever wants to divorce or marry a woman according to their customary codes, no one but the patriarch shall intervene. So there is an aspect in these where it deals with family law or aspects dealing with kind of religious issues of how the patriarch is allowed to govern. Nowhere does this talk about governing a community like an ethnarchy, like an ethnarch or a religious a millet bashi, or the leader of an entire millet. It's a berat specifically to run the church. And so as a result of that, you have it says, in matters relating to the patriarch, no one shall intervene, and he shall hold the church pamakaristos in the churches. So it also means that the responsibility for overseeing the physical real property of the churches, and that, of course, it even mentions kind of exemptions and other things for the church. And so again, this is a 1483, and it's an example We don't have anything like this for Patriarch Gennadios, but we do have some examples of this preceding for other local metropolitans coming from Ottomans as well. So in a sense, it follows this tradition of giving gifts and money and then yearly payments to the Sultan in order to remain in the see. So moving on, there are challenges that the Ecumenical Patriarchate faces as it's trying to rebuild the church. And so we want to think about what these things are. Now, the Ottoman Empire itself gets transformed when it expands. The Sultan Selim, known as Selim the Grim, ends up in 1516 and 17 taking over the Middle East. And when it does that, the character of the empire turns even more Islamic, because now it becomes the custodian of Mecca and Medina, and therefore it becomes in charge and using and bringing these the theological elements and the kind of Islamic administration more to bear on the Ottoman practice. And therefore, when Suleiman, the lawgiver, Kanuni, takes over, one of his goals is to reconcile Sharia, Sultanic Islamic law, with the Sultanic law. And so his goal, of course, is to, in doing that, he ends up finding that there's a big problem. In one of the patriarchal chronicles, there's the Patriarch Theoliptos in 1521. He is approached by someone from the community who hears the rumor that Sultan Suleiman wants to confiscate all the churches of Constantinople. And the reason being is that according to Islamic law, the churches should be because of a conquest, they should have been confiscated. They should not have been allowed to remain as Christian churches. So with that quandary, Patriarch Theoliptos was facing this big challenge, and he was thinking, how do I deal with this? And so he had some counselors among the Greek Orthodox counselors who said, oh, we'll help you, we'll think about this. And so they end up finding 3 aged janissaries. These are former Christians. They became janissary soldiers, right, Muslims, and who they decided they bring them to the Sultan's court to testify that, in fact, Constantine Palaiologos, the emperor, actually capitulated. And so as a result of that, he gave the city over, and that is what accounts for the fact that the churches exist. Now, of course, this is a fiction, but they do this, and there are 3 of them, which means in Islamic law, they are understood to be, legitimate witnesses. And so this puts the Sheikhul Islam, the Hanafi jurist, in charge of all of this big process in a quandary, because he is trying to understand and come up with a plan to confiscate and make this and legalize the Sharia. But now he's faced with an actual 3 legitimate Islamic witnesses. So in order to do this, we actually have records of this. Ebu Suud Effendi writes a fatwa that says, in fact, we understood that Sultan Fatih Mehmet conquered the city, but there are circumstances that within the conquest that certain elements and areas of the city actually capitulated, so certain quarters and things like that. And therefore, because of that element of capitulation, but of course it's during the conquest itself, during that, because they've done that, they are therefore allowed to remain as churches. So they had to do some gymnastics to try to make it work, because they actually had Islamic witnesses to address that issue. So I just wanted to briefly share with you, the Patriarchate moves multiple times. Of course, we know it begins at the Hagia Sophia at the conquest, and it proceeds to be move to the Church of the Holy Apostles, then the Church of the Pamakaristos, which exists today. The Church of the Holy Apostles was replaced by Sultan Mehmet as the mosque of Sultan Mehmet. The monastery of Makaristos, the Church of Theotokos Papademetriou, which was also in the Phanar, as well as Agios Dimitrios Kanavou in Xiloporta, kind of also in the Phanar, finally to get to St. George, which is the church that exists today, so it's from 1600. And just to give you a sense, Hagia Sophia is here, and then we have the Holy Apostles is here, and then of course Pamakaristos, yes, right up here, and then the Phanar is down here. So the other churches are in this area. So this is kind of the general region that we're talking about. And just these are the images. We don't have a version. Again, Mehmet saw the tradition was that Constantine was buried at the Church of Holy Apostles, and so he, as the new Caesar, wanted to have his own mosque on, and they destroy the church and put up his own mosque. There's the Church of Pamakaristos. Here's the ruins of the Church of Papademetriou, Theotokos Papademetriou. And then there's also an icon in the monastery of Iviron with that same title as well. And then the Church of Agios Dimitrios Kanavou, and then, of course, the present day. And as part of that, we know the church in the Phanar. And so just to give us a sense of the Patriarchate, there is, it resides in the Phanar, and we've had some stability in terms of location from 1600. But if we actually look at the changes of patriarchs, we actually see something very surprising. First of all, from 1500 to 1600, there are 22 changes. And this means that some patriarchs serve as second and third and even fourth terms. There are changes in 1600 to 1700, averaging 1.8 years. And so these 2 centuries in particular, and even to get to this here, the number of changes are significant, but especially 1600 to 1700, 1.8 year. And so among those things, what we find is that patriarchs are changing. The patriarch has to go to the Sultan to get kind of the berat. They have to give a peshkesh. They have to, the amounts, and there's competition sometimes. Some groups are having their own candidate and they offer something more, and then they go back and forth. So we find that this is a very kind of difficult time. There's very little stability, very little strength. It's a very weak institution. And so here's an example. This is not a patriarch, but it's a foreigner coming in to see the Sultan in the imperial divan. And this would be something that, an example of what we're talking about. And so just to give another, these are some contemporary images from from European travelers who are, these are called costume books. They basically, paint images and bring them back to the princes of Europe so they can be entertained by these things. And then travelers kind of, when we get the Solomon Schweiger, he actually writes about the history of the church. And so we end up getting these images and block cuts. And so one of the stories I wanted just to kind of briefly this is an image of Patriarch Jeremiah II. He's very well known for being involved with a discussion with the Germans. And so when it comes to his ability to go into the to be the multezim, we actually have an account of him going on a tour through Rumeli, collecting ecclesiastical taxes in the near the city of Trikala. And so as he's venturing towards that city, he's attacked by villagers, and he had been accompanied by a janissary. And we actually have an image of a bishop being accompanied by janissaries. That's a much later image, but still the idea is there. And so the villagers are wishing to kill them and steal their goods and money We don't know if it's because they know that this is the bishop, or just that they have money on hand, but their villagers were willing to kind of risk this. They understand they're going against the church and the state in the form of janissaries. The local gendarme, which is an image of a 16th century gendarme, steps forward and eventually stops them. Those poor villagers end up in a Ottoman kind of become rowers for the Ottoman imperial fleet, which is probably worse than being in a prison. So with all of that, we see the real weakness of the Patriarchate. I'm just going to go through some of the other images of Patriarch Jeremiah. And this is an image of the Patriarchate in the 16th century, actually the Papademetriou church, and then of a procession, another wood block as well. So that kind of takes us to this point where they've been very a weak institution. And the question is, how do they become strong? How do they consolidate authority? And one of the ways this happens has to do with what takes place with the Ottoman takeover of Cyprus and then later Crete. So with the conquest of Cyprus, we know that this had been previously a Venetian island. Roman Catholics governed it. And with all of that, the Patriarchate had very little control. First of all, Cyprus, according to Orthodox ecclesiology, is an autocephalous church. It's one of the old churches. But even so, there's like no ability to govern at all or to have any influence. When the Ottomans take it, in 1571, 72, they actually this whole experience means that they are now kind of riding the wave of Ottoman imperial expansion, and they are the preferred, let's say, ecclesiastical body. And so they begin to take over formerly Venetian churches. They also have a bit of conflict because, with the local Cypriot ecclesiastical groups. But eventually the Patriarchate has kind of the sheer force of being part of this imperial capital and imperial empire, imperial enterprise, that it, in a sense, begins to kind of take over and begin being very influential in the appointments of the bishops of Cyprus. And so again, we have Jeremiah is active. He's also kind of ends up on these tours. He goes to Russia. He eventually even is kind of forced. He's kind of he's not quite kidnapped in Russia, but they hold him. He gets sick, and then they kind of keep him until he promises to make the Russian church autocephalous. And so that happens in 1589. So another interesting aspect there. So then we get to the next era, and I'll be this next couple centuries, I'm going to be wrapping up fairly quickly. So I'm going to go much more quickly. So I only have a few more minutes. We know that there's the patriarch moves from weakness to strength among the individuals that are responsible for kind of at least being very active. Is someone named Cyril Lucaris. He's a patriarch of Constantinople. He is intent on the renewal of the Christian faith. He's an anti-papist, but he's also charged with being a Protestant. In fact, he creates and writes a confession of faith that's very, very Protestant. And so he has the Jesuits themselves see these Protestant proclivities, and they end up going to the Sultan to ask for him to be removed. Ultimately, he's executed. One of the things he does, of course, is he established, he has a printing press. One of his friends, Metaxas, becomes a printer to try and print the Bible in Greek. And so he begins some of that. And that has a tradition that begins around this time as well. He ultimately he's a powerful figure, but he doesn't manage to kind of stay for long. So there's other issues of consolidation that have taken place, and that So 1640s to 1660s, again, the idea that the state is expanding, taking over Crete. And once they take Crete, this does become one of those issues where the Patriarchate establishes its firm authority. It takes a little bit of time. They actually struggle against the monks of Mount Sinai, who had, during the Venetian rule, had kind of been in that area. And this consolidation, of course, shows that they are able to use their own power as well as the state's power in order to control their territory. But despite that, in the Qadi court registers of Constantinople, we find patriarchs are borrowing money. They are from Muslims. We have I have 3 examples. I'm not going to read them to you, but they're actually borrowing money. Patriarch Dionysius, Parthenius IV, is, in order to become patriarch, he went into debt. He borrowed money from a military commander, El Hajj Qasim Aga Abdul Menan, and the widow of him wants the money back, and so they go to court. Parthenius is succeeded by Dionysius, who borrows money from the the debt was transferred to him, and he's forced to pay it. And then finally, there's another example, Dionysius IV, who borrows money from the Pious Foundation of Sultan Ahmed in the religious school. He's borrowing money from an Islamic religious school in order to become patriarch. So this notion of being multazim continues into this period, keeping the institution very weak. And so I'm going to kind of move along just to talk about one of the things that we do see in the codices of the Patriarchate are that there are a number of elements. These are from the synodal acta, the documents of the Patriarchate. But we find that there are a number of elections that are in place, resignations, depositions, and you see here failing to fulfill the financial obligation to the Patriarchate and others. There are 18 examples of that. So you can see that there's a preoccupation among the Patriarchate. This is not that they are greedy themselves, that this is the system, the Ottoman system, that they have to live within and the constraints of that system. And what you see, though, the last part is interesting, the Stavropygion. This means monasteries that are directly under the Patriarchate. So in looking at that last element, Stavropygion pronouncements, we begin to see the first inkling of this is the Patriarchate pushing to gain control. By gaining control of local monasteries directly under the control, they are able to extend themselves kind of directly over religious institutions. And so we begin to see these things taking place. So this is a period I call a consolidation of authority, and I'm going to move on. So in a sense, going to this notion of developing of an ethnarch, we begin to see kind of by the late 18th century, a series of responsibilities, right? The Patriarch with the Synod has control of the ecclesiastical organization, the bishops, churches, and monasteries and their possessions. But if you look down at the red, the Patriarch's responsible for the orderly and loyal behavior of his flock towards the ruling authorities and ensuring that the taxes are paid. So that's kind of a general statement. These are kind of identified, they're summaries, and they're not from the sources themselves, but they are they are aspects to show that the ecclesiastical institution is gaining more authority. And another example of that is something that takes place apparently by the 1760s. They've gained enough authority that some of the local bishops don't want the Patriarch to be that powerful, and they decide they're going to make sure that the Patriarchate has some sort of check on its authority by establishing what's known as hierondismos. this is a reaction to the domination of individual patriarchs, because the phanariot class gets involved in controlling the institution. But in order to put the brakes on this kind of authoritarian rise, or rise of authority, I should say, not authoritarian, rise of authority, that they decide that any major decision has to have 4 metropolitans agree. So the patriarch no longer is the sole kind of decider, and then kind of, but in fact, and the synod kind of just approving that. But in fact, you need, in order to approve, you have to have 4, and you see the seal below that has to have 4 parts put together in order for it to be sanctioned. And so here we are, and we come up to this 19th century experience. And this is where we begin to see the aspects of the reform and the and nationalism taking its toll on the Patriarchate. And of course, within the church, you see kind of individuals dressed as Ottomans, right? These are local Christians within the church, and leading up to what is the very famous experience of the Greek Revolution that takes place. And in fact, it is the experience of the retribution against the sitting patriarch. Now, ironically, the Patriarch Gregory V and the Synod actually had condemned the revolutionaries just prior to this, and in a sense condemning the Filiketeria as being part of this Enlightenment atheistic European group. And so this idea that the things as they've been established under the Ottomans are God ordained, and therefore we should not necessarily bother that. This is what God wanted. We're going to kind of remain. So they condemned the revolutionaries, but even with that, that Gregory V ends up being killed. Now, just to say, the Ottomans understood they couldn't just kill a patriarch, a sitting patriarch. So, in fact, earlier that day, they call in his successor, and they have him. They remove Gregory V from patriarch, and they elevate his successor, Evgenios, I think. Patriarch Evgenios, and after he's elevated, formally kind of at least voted, then they go and take him off from the Easter services. They remove him and they murder him. And of course, his body ends in the Bosphorus, and it's recovered to Ukraine and then to Athens. So leading to another era, the Tanzimat reforms are general reforms where the Ottoman state is now moving towards citizenship rights and kind of a transformation. So this is actually where the church and the Patriarchate begins to really lose its, it had ascended to a great power, and now it's facing major challenges. And so these reforms are creating subjects become citizens, parliamentary democracy, and no longer needing the church to be the person who is the intermediary. And so these Ottoman regulations actually established what is known as, it abolishes gerondismos, establishing a mixed council of lay and clerical representatives. And these actually gather at the Patriarchate to administer the Patriarchate. And in fact, that is a mixed council that exists up until 1923. They participate in administration, they elect the Patriarch. And this actually stems from the Ottoman general regulations of the 1860s and kind of the transformations taking place in the Ottoman context. And so, of course, the other aspect of this is that there's a rise of national churches. And so, of course, Greece breaks off. There's an exarchate that ends up becoming a call to have their own independent Bulgarian church, and that's what they call this. It actually has a long history of conflict, and the Patriarchate condemns this as we don't have ethnophiletism. This is kind of a condemnation of and even bringing it to the point of heresy, that these national church kind of organizations ought not to happen. And it's a conflict that takes place at that point. Nevertheless, the tide of the national churches is so powerful that as the Ottoman state breaks away, you have the establishment of a Romanian, a Serbian, and an Albanian independent church. And then, of course, we get to the era of the Balkan Wars to the up to 1922 and then 23, where we find that the Patriarchate now has, by 1923, has lost 1.5 million communicants, not to mention all those who had been killed previously. This is so, in fact, going from an institution that had like this large Mediterranean-wide kind of jurisdiction, now it has Constantinople. And in fact, the notion that the Patriarch is, after the Treaty of Lausanne, is understood to be the Istanbul Rum Patriarch, right? The Patriarch of Istanbul, and so of the Istanbul Church. So in a sense, it goes from this kind of large institution. So now it collapses and it comes to be. Now that doesn't negate the fact that the Patriarchate still claimed its ecumenical authority, and through the 20th century, of course, it has these kind of a very difficult era. But towards the last patriarch, of course, has expanded and allowed for the ecumenical presence to be much more broadly understood. And so this is kind of in a sense, a new era for the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So I've taken a full hour, and I apologize if that's too lengthy or too long, but at any rate, I wanted to give you a kind of an overview, but spend a little bit of time for some of the underlying principles of what this means. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Professor Papademetriou, for that sort of fascinating presentation. It's a massive subject, and I'm sure you could deliver a semester-long course on this. And especially the last few centuries, they were covered very quickly, but it is massive. And where do you start, and where do you finish? I might just kickstart off the questioning. You said that at the onset of Ottoman rule, the Greeks, or the Greek Orthodox under the Ottoman Empire, weren't quite under millet system. When would you say was the tipping point where, in the 17th century or something, where they moved to more a millet system?
Yeah, so I think the era of the 18th century is when we begin to really see the authority of the church become much more pervasive. And so I would say that also coincides with the number of things going on in the Ottoman context, meaning there's a rise of what we call the ionization. Ion are local notables who become very powerful. And so one of the classic that everyone knows is Ali Pasha of Yanina. He's an Ion. He has his own power base, his own army, his own kind of control over things. And so in a sense, this is an idea I'm playing with. I've written about it and presented a bit, but I see this as a moment where the Patriarchate represents, in a sense, these Ion characteristics, and he has kind of a power base, and the Phanariates become important in helping him prop up his authority. And so that's when we see that he starts to have even more authority that goes beyond just the ecclesiastical, but even into the other spheres. And so I think that's the era that I'm talking about.
Thanks for that. I've got a question here from John Consulis. What is the current post-19th century Patriarchate view of local arrangements of bishops with local emirs in the 13th and 14th century? So how does the modern Patriarchate sort of view that?
That's a good question. I don't know. No, I mean, I've spoken to various individuals, and I think they're very practical. So just in talking generally in some of these things, they're very practical. They understood that, even contemporary hierarchs and people within the institution know that the Ottoman experience is part of their, they've lived with it. It's helped, shape some of the things that they do. It certainly, I think, even more so the modern Republican era is probably more, has shaped them even more because of all the constraints and constrictions. But in terms of looking at the past, I think they're realistic to say, well, bishops, these are acts of individuals trying to do their best to do their, either in the center or in the provinces, trying to figure out how to survive. And I think that's kind of what the attitude. But I don't know for sure because I haven't really asked them specifically. So.
Okay. I'm going to ask this question because it was posed last week and you probably didn't get a complete answer. You did mention before that the Church of Greece became autocephalous in 1833. But because we're both sort of interested in sort of diaspora history, I think in the earlier 20th century, Australian and also probably the US and Canada came under the jurisdiction of the autocephalous sort of Church of Greece. Why was that jurisdiction transferred to the Patriarchate in Constantinople in the 1920s?
Right. So
thoughts on that all?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to the prerogatives of the Fourth Council, that the Fourth Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon, that in fact, so they're going back to the earlier idea that the territory of the barbarian people, right, is kind of like the lands outside of the Mediterranean world. That's kind of the Greek world in a sense, and so they're making that the underpinning for that idea. I also think it has to do with the fact that they have just lost their major. At that moment, there are a couple things going on. There's kind of this new immigration issue that they never had conceived of before. So that's just happening. I mean, in the States a little bit earlier, but in Australia. So they had never had to kind of address that in this way before, but also the loss of faithful of their own jurisdiction forced them to say, well, who is our flock now? And therefore, I think that's part of it, is that even though they collapsed like through nationalist kind of breakoffs to the Treaty of Lausanne, meaning that it's a Constantinopolitan patriarchate, they then transform and say, okay, now we have to look at the diaspora. These come under our authority. And I think those things converge at the same time. And I think that's why there's a transfer. I haven't really thought about it, but I'm just kind of, that's an interesting question.
Okay. Thanks for that. Another question from John. Are the current contributions of the Patriarchate funneled to the Turkish state? Or?
No, not that I know of. I think that the state does have restrictions, but that whole era of the Peshkesh actually gets abolished in the, I didn't get to say that, in the Tanzimat era. In fact, in the Tanzimat documents, they describe that those things are no longer expected and they shouldn't be collected. So that ends in the 1850s and 60s at the latest, or at least formally. And what happens kind of on an informal basis is something else. I don't have any evidence for that. So I don't expect that this has happened at all. But we're not privy to what the situation is.
I've got another question from our audience. The high turnover of patriarchs between the 17th and 19th century appears to have an element of cloak and dagger to it. Was this the case? So
I would say that the patriarchal chronicles that describe these things, if you read them, it kind of makes for a high drama, especially the case of there's one of the figures. It's fascinating. Fatih Sultan Mehmet's stepmother is Mara Brankovic. She's a Serbian. She's kind of imperial family, and he stays close to her. She has a favorite kind of bishop, a spiritual father, if you will, that she wants to make to be patriarch. And so she kind of pushes him forward, and then there's a lot of pushback against him. Then they start to call him, oh, he's been Islamized, and he's now just a, we need to confirm that. So they actually have, within the context of this investigation, they forced the poor man to lift up his robes to show he's not circumcised, and he's kind of within, he hasn't turned. And it becomes this kind of, there are these kind of stories. The story of Raphael is another one, and Yosef jumping in a well. I mean, from the standpoint of drama, I think, and Cloak and Dagger, I think there's quite a lot of that. I think what's behind it, though, and this is kind of what I always talk about, these financial constraints become institutionalized in a way that the individuals can't escape. They can't escape that and just kind of do their thing. They are always constrained. They need to find the money to do it. So they're always looking for ways in order to gain that. And so they're borrowing money from an Islamic vakif, a religious school, and so they're forced to do these things. One of the examples I didn't talk about was 1697. There's one guy, he's a defrocked metropolitan of Thessaloniki. He goes to the Sultan and says, listen, I will take care of everything for you. And he promises he will run all of the patriarchates together, including Alexandria, Antioch, and all the other ones. And the patriarchs hear about this, and they freak out, and they go to the patriarch, to the Sultan, and they kind of say this is unacceptable. But they write the synodal decree, and in a sense, they say we have to come together to fight this one guy who's trying to take over the entire church as a financial, to be the multizim of everyone. And so anyway, they all gather together, and they end up making this decree to get rid of him. So these things do happen. I think that the drama is there, and Cloak and Dagger, I suppose, could be part of that as well.
Just one thing I want to raise. I know you're sort of researching at the moment. You mentioned something about Ali Pasha. So let's say the churches in his jurisdiction in Epirus, would they be sort of funneling their collected funds to him or to the center, or that was part of the conflict that occurred?
So I think one of the issues that we find is that consistently in the Ottoman courts, the patriarch is going and complaining, either or metropolitans who are closer, one step down, closer to the communities. They're complaining that their local bishops or their monks are not complying, and we actually have the Sultan issuing statements. Make sure you go investigate. They tell their local Qadi, go investigate, and if this is true, make sure that they pay their dues, or take action if necessary, things like that. So in a sense, in a place under Ali Pasha, that becomes harder because Ali Pasha wants to be independent himself. So I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know if the metropolitans under Ali Pasha's rule are complying with patriarchal the patriarchal system, or they're deciding to be independent. What we find in the early centuries is when there's an authority outside, that the metropolitans sometimes decide to side with the local authority and ignore the center. So I don't know. It's a good question. I think I have to look into that.
Might finish off with the final question. I was quite impressed in your resume that you've had access to the Ottoman archives and doing your research in the book that you've published. I also know, or I've read, that the majority of Ottoman archives pertaining to Greece haven't actually been sort of translated or even sort of covered. So what type of future developments can we expect research in this area?
Well, I have to say, when I started out, which is 30 years ago, right, in my graduate school career. That's hard to say, right? But I was perhaps, I mean, there were maybe a small handful of individuals. John Alexander, who's at this University of Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, was one of the but he had been an American. He had an American citizenship, and he was able to enter the archive. So for a while, there was a difficulty for Greek scholars to enter the Ottoman archives. That has since changed, and so we have, some good Ottomanists from the University of Crete and from other places, Thessaloniki, that are actually working in the field, as well as people from Turkey and other places of the Balkans are interested in topics related to the either Greek areas or kind of the non-Muslims in society. And so I think that there's a lot more today. There's way more available and even more interest for these relations as well. And so I think that it's very hopeful. You can find quite a number of published sources with translations and other things like that. So I actually think it's a very exciting time, and I think the field is really it's very vibrant at the moment.
Okay. Look, I think we probably need to bring things to a close. It's bordering on an hour and a half. Thank you for waking up at these early hours to sort of accommodate us, Professor Papademetriou. And hopefully one day we'll have you in the flesh in Melbourne as well, presenting.
I would love that. I would love that. Yes. Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much. And just a reminder to next week's seminar at the Greek Center. It is a hybrid seminar. You can come and see it live at the Greek Center or be simultaneously broadcast as well. Thanks once again, everyone, for participating.